The way we are trained and brought up to view the Old Testament is, I think, the most important thing we can say about that is that it is a preparation for the new. And we have this idea of the Old Testament being fulfilled by Jesus Christ. And the Vatican Council says, he's the fullness of revelation, therefore everything which came before him was leading up to him. Now that obviously is a Christian perspective on the Old Testament, and it's valid. Of course it's valid, because for us this revelation of God goes through the Old Testament period into the New, and indeed continues in the time of the Church. But one of the things that the Vatican Council in its document on Revelation points out when it talks about the Old Testament is to invite us to consider the value of the Old Testament in itself. And so we're being invited also to say, well, to recognize that there are teachings, that there are prayers, for example, that there are values contained there which have their own worth and must be taken seriously in themselves. Of course they do, they are part of a stage of development, but perhaps we need also to look at the Old Testament and discover the value of so much of it in itself. When we do that, we can recognize its quality. We can also say, well, our Jewish brothers and sisters who still treasure what we call the Old Testament, what they call the Tanakh, the scriptures, the law, and the prophets and the writings, we can value them, we can recognize the value of those writings with our Jewish brothers and sisters, so that there is a richness there which is certainly not disregarding the fulfillment in Christ, but which actually also might help us to understand better what we mean by fulfillment. There is another point that we tend to think, well, the prophets, for example, of the Old Testament, well, they're all about preparing for Jesus. That's all about the coming of the Messiah. And then when we actually go and read a prophet like Isaiah, for example, we find that their references to the Messiah are actually very few. There's a lot of material that is different, that might be teaching about social justice, teaching about faith, speculation about the future. So that if we are to value the scriptures and all parts of the scriptures, we need to be open to this, looking at the Old Testament books also in themselves and seeing what value we have there. If you look at the Psalms, for example, we tend to relate so much in the Psalms to Jesus, but then they have their own status as prayer, as perhaps prayer of lamentation or prayer of exaltation. They've got that as well. So one of the things that Christian and Jewish study of the books of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures, has done is to show us that there's a tremendous richness there, almost in its own right, as well as preparing us for the coming of Jesus. And then when we look at the New Testament, we see how it quotes from the Old Testament. It's illustrating fulfillment. But very often, some of the use of the Old Testament is, well, what the writers have done is say, well, what can I show you from our old scriptures that helps you understand Jesus? Right? So the Old Testament is written not to proclaim Jesus before he came, but to proclaim the truth of God at that time. And when the New Testament writers come, they say, well, given what we already know about God from the Old Testament, how can we use that to help us understand? So that idea of fulfillment is actually quite complicated. It's not that God said one thing in the Old Testament and then it's fulfilled and therefore Jesus is the Messiah. It's a little bit more complicated than that.